78% of Russians support the war in Ukraine, according to surveys. Tens of thousands attended government rallies and supported Putin, waving national flags and shouting patriotic chants. The streets of Russian cities are full of Z letters, which symbolize the so-called special military operation. People on the streets say that Ukraine must be destroyed, and hardly anyone protests against the war.
Когда бандеровцев перебьем, тогда будет мир.
This picture dominates Russian state media, but what is much worse, many people in Western countries think that this is a real picture. In this video, I will prove that it is a thoroughly constructed piece of the Russian propaganda. If you believe that almost all Russians support this war, Putin has won your mind then. But let's dive into this question and figure out what's really going on. The reality is much more difficult and much more dramatic. But first, please subscribe to this channel, where I explain various topics about Russia. My name is Dmitry Kolezev, I'm a Russian journalist in exile, and my mission here on YouTube is to give you more context and details about Russia-related issues. So, let's start. This girl is a Russian independent artist. Her name is Sasha Skocilenko. In 2022, when the full-scale war started, she conducted a small protest action. She printed fake price tags and changed them in a grocery store in St. Petersburg. For example, one of them said, "Russian troops have destroyed 80% of the city of Mariupol. What for?" Another one, "Stop the war. In the first 3 days of the war, 4,300 Russian soldiers were killed. Why is Russian TV silent about it?" Or, "Putin has been lying for 20 years. The result of this lie is our readiness to justify the war in Ukraine." 10 days later, Sasha was found and arrested. Since then, she remains behind bars, waiting for sentencing. She faces up to 10 years in prison. Sasha Skocilenko is just one of 530 Russian political activists, journalists, artists, and so on, who have been convicted of so-called anti-war crimes. 130 of them are in prison now. I can't name all of them now, but I'll put a running line of names at the bottom of the screen. And here are just the most famous names: Ilya Yashin, Alexei Gorinov, Vladimir Kara-murza, Maria Ponomarenko, Alexei Moskalev. Others are not only political activists, but ordinary people too: teachers, doctors, workers, and so on. Just after the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine, Russian authorities passed new laws that allowed them to throw in jail anyone who writes or speaks against the war. The maximum sentence for these crimes now is 15 years in prison, in Russian prison that is infamous for its tortures. In previous years, Putin had been consistently introducing censorship, destroying his political opponents, and taking political rights away from Russian citizens. But even in Putin's Russia, these new laws seemed like a desperate step to silence protesters. By the way, I'm one of the accused of these crimes too. I'm on the wanted list in Russia. The criminal case against me was opened after I had posted on Instagram about Russian war crimes in Bucha. That's why today even a small protest against the war could lead to a broken life. However, tens of thousands of Russians were brave enough to protest even facing this oppression. But millions of others just watch and think, that's what I would get if I openly oppose the war. To warn people against protests, Russian authorities developed a system of penalties and punishments. The lightest one is a big fine, the most severe is a long sentence in prison. If you go to a picket or rally, you can be arrested for up to 30 days, and about 20,000 Russians have been detained for anti-war protests. But the line between administrative and criminal case is so faint that you never know whether you will be fined or put in prison. Sometimes people are punished for the most innocent things: sneakers in the colors of the Ukrainian flag, or laying flowers at a monument to a Ukrainian poetess. If you send money to help Ukraine, you can be charged with high treason and sentenced to life in prison. Most of these 20,000 were detained during the anti-war protests in the first days after the invasion. Sasha Skocilenko was one of them, so her art protest in the grocery store wasn't the only way to express her disagreement with the war. The next step of Kremlin to suppress the anti-war movement was total censorship in the media. Although big Russian media had been owned by Kremlin or pro-Kremlin oligarchs for years, in early 2022 there were still some independent internet media outlets in Russia. Their total audience used to be tens of millions, and because of their professionalism and their trustworthiness, in some cases they successfully competed with pro-Kremlin TV channels and newspapers. When the war started, most of these media outlets began to cover fighting in Ukraine as professionals, getting information from different sources, providing photos and videos from the battlefield, and being skeptical about propaganda messages. Many of them openly held anti-war positions and called the full-scale invasion a political and war crime. And what did Putin do? He just blocked all the independent media in Russia and cut them from their audience. I mean, literally all of them. The Office of General Prosecutor reported that it blocked 125,000 web pages for spreading disinformation about the war. Among them, there were the largest media outlets such as Meduza or TV Rain. Echo of Moscow, a popular liberal radio station, was shut down, and Novaya Gazeta, the new newspaper, an independent newspaper, was closed. Journalists faced prison in case they tried to cover the war truthfully. Instagram and Facebook were blocked too. Twitter was slowed down, and the Russian main search engine Yandex banned all the blocked websites. Yes, you can use a VPN service to open blocked Instagram or website, and many Russians do so, but tens of millions who don't have enough time and energy to attentively follow the news were just cut from any information not fitting the official narrative. YouTube and Telegram now are the only major platforms that are not blocked in Russia. That's why many journalists started their own YouTube channels. But as surveys say, for 62% of Russians, TV is still the main source of information. 42% read the news on websites, and only 23% get news from social media, including YouTube. That's why Kremlin dominates the information space. Kremlin knows it's important to give people the right picture. According to research, in 2022 alone, Putin's government spent about $2 billion on propaganda. Kremlin controls mass TV channels and big newspapers and hundreds of local media outlets all across the country. This media machine shows a distorted picture of real life. People are full of enthusiasm. Everybody supports the government and Russian army, and only a few renegades, sponsored by the West, oppose this fair and even sacred special operation. The West attacked Russia in Ukraine, and Russia had to protect itself.
Понимаете, кто делает первый шаг, они нападают, значит, мы защищаемся. И они на нас напали. Мы вынуждены защищаться. Мы на них не нападали. Это надо понимать. Они пытаются эту картинку перевернуть, Запад, якобы мы напали. Это вранье, это ложь. Напал Запад на нас, и мы вынуждены защищаться. Мы на Запад не нападали.
When you see a small piece of Russian propaganda, you might think, who would even believe this? But just imagine that you have listened to and watched it every day for months or years, cut from other sources of information. What would happen to your state of mind? Can you guarantee that you will resist it? And what about your friends, your relatives? When I read about propaganda in Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia, I used to think, how could people be so stupid as to trust such bullshit? But now I can see how it works. Propaganda is a really powerful thing, and that's why independent journalism is so important. By the way, I'll be happy if you support my attempt to develop an independent YouTube channel about Russian-related issues by subscribing to my Patreon. The link is below. Thank you. Propaganda is not only TV, radio, websites, and newspapers. Rallies of support and symbols of military operation all across Russia are part of propaganda as well. But when rare independent journalists manage to visit these rallies, They understand that people come there because their bosses told them to do so. Hundreds of buses bring people from neighboring regions to Moscow, and sometimes people are even paid for this. The same thing with Z symbols. It's a kind of Russian swastika, but according to people in Russia, Russians very rarely put Z letters on their cars, houses, or clothes voluntarily. Most of these symbols are there as a result for some administrative actions, so this support campaign is mostly orchestrated by the Kremlin. In the summer of 2022, American Radio Liberty, Radio Svoboda, published a Vox Pop video from Moscow. It's a classical journalistic format when people answer a reporter's question on the street. One of the passersby said that he doesn't support the Russian army and mentioned the tragedy in Bucha.
Наше правительство говорило о том, что оно хочет как бы с националистами бороться, но бомбит торговые центры, в Буче мирных жителей. Наши военные из Бурятии, из Дагестана расстреливали вообще без причин.
8 months later, this man was detained and informed that there was a criminal case against him because of his participation in that video. Luckily, he wasn't arrested, but this case was a serious message to journalists that they can't put their speakers at such risk. I'm telling this story not just to give you another example of repression in Putin's Russia. It shows why we can be sure about different sociological surveys in Russia. In the usual situation, in a democratic society, you can just go to the street or call people to ask what they think about one issue or another. In today's Russia, it's impossible. Almost everyone knows that it's unsafe to express any anti-war opinion. Life in an authoritarian country makes you suspicious. Who knows if this man is a real pollster or a FSB agent? Is this a real phone call from sociological service or a kind of provocation? It's better not to answer or answer what the government wants to hear. I respect those independent sociologists such as Levada Center or Russian Field who try to get some sociological data even in this situation. It has its value because some information is better than nothing, and at least we can estimate the dynamics of answers. But I urge you not to make any conclusions when you see headlines like 75% of Russians support the war in Ukraine. The correct headline should be sociologists say that according to their survey, 75% of those who agreed to answer say that they support the actions of the Russian army and government, but actually we don't know if they were sincere or not. After several attempts to understand what Russians think, sociologists came up with a question about peace talks. And it turned out that the majority of Russians simultaneously support the Russian army but want peace talks. Maybe it's a safe way to express their anti-war views. According to different research, in 2022 and 2023, from several hundred thousand to 1.5 million people left Russia. We don't know exactly what the numbers are and how many of them emigrated because of war and political repression, but journalists and some researchers confidently speak about the new wave of Russian immigration. But if many Russians are against the war and the regime doesn't allow them to protest, why didn't all of them move somewhere else? I think you understand how silly it sounds, but let me explain why immigration is so difficult for many Russians now. First, not so many Russians even have a passport that allows them to leave the country. According to a survey, only 30% of Russians have it. In 2022, there was a spike in the number of applications for international passports, but the number is still relatively low. Second, to leave the country, you need money. You have to buy tickets, rent an apartment, and eat and drink something. And if you have a job that can be done remotely, it sounds realistic, but tens of millions have jobs without remote options. Russians do not have high incomes, and most of them have no savings at all. What could they do? Third, you need to know a foreign language, and unfortunately, not many Russians speak English or other languages. And before blaming us for it, keep in mind that only 20% of Americans can speak a second language. Fourth, when you decide to move, you have to move somewhere, right? But It's very difficult to get a European or United States visa in Russia now. Eastern European countries such as Baltic countries or Poland actually closed their borders to Russia. Most people go to neighboring countries such as Armenia, Kazakhstan and Georgia. Russians are grateful for their hospitality, but there are not enough jobs and homes for millions of people. Fifth, what if you have children who go to school or elder relatives who need care? Yes, if something directly threatens your life, you might run away despite all these factors. But the majority of Russians are not in immediate danger. Like any other people, they weigh risks and make rational decisions. I don't want to say that there are no real supporters of the war in Russia. Unfortunately, they do exist. But it's not a very big group. According to different research, it's maybe 15–30% of population. They are constant audience of propaganda shows and they are full of resentment. They see this war as a way to demonstrate Russia's power to the West.
Как вы думаете, добьем, не добьем?
Добьем однозначно, отступать там некуда.
Вы сами, если что, пойдете, не пойдете, если...
Пойду.
On the other side, there are anti-war Russians who are strongly against the military invasion of Ukraine. Even according to surveys, there are 20% of such people. It's about 20 million adults. Between these two radical groups are about 50–60% of Russians who don't support war and don't oppose it. They are just silent and don't want to have any problems.
Мы как-то политику не очень хотим обсуждать.
Да, у нас как бы красота, любовь, здоровье, сила.
Про любовь хотите?
Больше про любовь, да. А освободительная война?
Should we blame these people? Maybe. But it's easy to do it from a safe space, from a Western democratic country. Imagine a person who has been bombarded with the propaganda for many years, who sees severe political repressions around them, who doesn't have enough information because of censorship, and whose relatives could be in danger. And another important thing, this person doesn't believe that protest could change anything. He or she thinks, the war is bad, but what can I do? If I protest, they'll put me in prison. My children will lose their parents, my life will be destroyed, and it will change nothing. So it's better to wait. Be honest with yourself. Would you behave differently? Amazingly, there are still some people in Russia who are brave enough to protest. They are real heroes. But heroes cannot be the majority. If we look at the history of dictatorships, we'll see that regimes rarely fall just because of people's protests. In strong dictatorships, protests alone can't lead to significant change. Germans didn't overthrow Hitler until he was defeated by allies, although there was some attempts to kill him in 1944. The Chinese tried to protest in 1989, but it didn't help to change the system. Spain, Portugal and Italy survived long periods of dictatorship before they came to democracy. In the last decade, Hong Kong, Iran and Belarus showed us examples of massive but futile protests. I don't want to justify Russians. Unfortunately, many of them support this war, but no smaller number don't. Tens of thousands protested and were punished, and hundreds are facing prison or are already put there. I wish more people protested in Russia, but I understand why they don't do that. I can speak on behalf of every Russian, which is why I'm speaking on behalf of myself. I personally think that I am responsible for this war, morally and politically as a Russian citizen. I am opposing this war and trying to do my best as a journalist and blogger. I support Ukrainians with money, but I understand my privilege. I moved from Russia and can speak freely. I sacrificed some things for this, but my freedom of speech is very important to me, and I had special circumstances: no children, remote job, some savings, and knowledge of English. Tens of millions of my compatriots just can't afford it. I urge you, try to see beyond the stereotypes and labels that we tend to use. The war is enormous evil that is being carried out in the name of every Russian, but don't let Putin deceive you. Not every Russian supports this war, and thousands are suffering in their attempts to stop it. The world must fight against Russian aggression and Putin's regime, but not against all Russians. Please, support the anti-war movement in Russia. pay attention to victims of Putin's regime inside Russia and support Russian independent journalism. Thank you and goodbye.